Okay, hi everybody. It's really a pleasure to have you all here at Elon tonight, and I really appreciate your being here. As Jesse said, I'm Amanda Sturgill, and I teach in the School of Communications here. So my purpose tonight is to sort of outline some things about the field of global learning in general, what scholars think they have a pretty good handle on, some things that we've learned in our symposium, and things that we think we still don't have good answers for. But as a way of doing that, because I'm a communications person, I thought I would tell you some stories. So I'm going to tell you some stories about some people called the Stocks. So first up, and it will be 5 stories tonight, we have Sally Stock. So here's Sally, and she is pictured here with her sorority sister at the end of the spring semester. And they are both obviously very excited because they're headed to London in the fall, along with 9 other members of their sorority, as a part of their school's Semester in London program. And her mother suggested to Sally that she blog about her experience. So if you opened up her blog and read it, she would write, "I'm going to Hogwarts this fall." Well, not really, but I'm going on a London study abroad. I'll be studying British Lit in the place where it all happened. Plus, I feel like I have been waiting all my life to go see the world, and London seemed like the perfect place to start from. On the weekends, I'll be a short flight from Paris, from Rome, from Amsterdam, from everywhere. Sally is a very typical off-campus student. Like about 2/3 of the around 300,000 students from the US who head overseas to study in a given year, she's a woman. Like about 3/4 of them, she's white. And she's headed to the most popular country for US students to go abroad to, which is the UK. She's going to have a bunch of her friends with her, and she's even going to have a professor from her school because it's a center-based program that she's participating in. And Sally thinks she's really ready for this experience because her school has helped her to be ready. They had sessions on what the money looks like and how to deal with it. And they had sessions on how the transportation works and what mind the gap means. And she knows what to do if she gets sick. And she knows that the place where she's going to be staying is going to be a little different from what she's used to at home, but she thinks it'll be fine because at least she knows her roommate because it's someone else who's coming from her same school. And she can't wait to meet all of the other kids from the States who are going to be staying in the international dorm with her. Sally has an opportunity for global learning. And if we measure her knowledge, taking British Lit in London could indeed be different than taking British Lit here, depending on how the course is taught. If we measure her intercultural competence development, there's a little bit more of a risk there. Now, she's a woman, and we know from research that just like in preteens, girls mature faster than boys in global learning. She'll be living and learning with other Americans, on the other hand. And so if she takes the chance to reflect on her cultural experience, if her program offers some kind of a cultural mentor for her, that would be really helpful, and she could learn quite a bit and develop in her intercultural competence. However, given the preparation that her school has given her to this point, which was pretty much all logistical, I kind of doubt it. But this experience could set her up for additional experiences in the future. And so Sally's story is still being written. Next up, we'll meet Steve Stock. Now, Steve is a finance major at a big state regional campus, and he's participating in a domestic off-campus study that is really very short-term. In his Maymester class, his whole class is going to visit New York City for a week of visiting the stock and commodities markets, meeting with an alum who works in finance in the city, meeting a venture capitalist, and they have a day built in their week there to just go and look around with the task of figuring out how the world of finance affects the lives of people in New York. Steve is also very excited because he's never been out of his state before. His professor is requiring that they do a reflection journal for the trip, and if you look at Steve's first entry, he was asked what he was excited about, what he was worried about, and what he thought he was likely to learn on the trip. And here are Steve's answers. He said, "I'm really excited about the chance to go and see the finance industry firsthand. Here in the city where my university is, I know a few stockbrokers and I know that there are banks, but this will be the whole thing all put together. I'm worried about 2 things, money and getting lost. I had to get extra hours at my barista job to come up with the money to pay the extra for this trip. And I know that those meals that I'm going to have to buy for myself in New York are going to be really expensive. I've also never been to a city this big before. My high school social studies class did take a trip to the state capitol, but we all stayed together as a group, so nobody got lost. I've heard that if you're looking at a map in New York, you're going to get mugged. And I don't want to take the subway the wrong direction or have something like that happen to me." Steve represents the changing face of off-campus study. First is his major. The demographics of universities as a whole have changed, with fewer students majoring in liberal arts and more students majoring in majors like STEM and in the professional fields. And off-campus study has changed as well, matching up somewhat with the composition of the student body. So the number of participants who come from those professional fields and come from STEM is rising. However, for those students, getting those off-campus experiences can be tricky, because a lot of times they have programs that are accredited, or they have very specific sequences of courses that they have to take in the right order, and it's hard to fit in a semester experience like Sally's for a Steve. So for a Steve, one of those short-term experiences may be a more realistic thing to do and still graduate in those 4 years. So short-term and those embedded courses like Steve's are becoming more common. Researchers are still mapping the efficacy of those kind of experiences in engendering that knowledge, those skills, and those behaviors and attitudes that are those desirable outcomes for off-campus study. And the verdict, frankly, is mixed right now. Generally, it's fair to say that if you have a high-quality, mentored short-term experience, it can still be impactful. What's less well understood at this point is if the elements of the experience itself need to change in some way because of a function of the duration where they're going. Now, Steve is a male student, and so he may gain less from his experience just because of that, but one thing Steve really has going for him is his personality. Steve is very outgoing. And so even on his short off-campus experience, Steve had that afternoon of free time, and unfortunately, he did get lost. He was hungry, too. So he was counting his pennies, and he bought the cheapest lunch that he saw, which was a hot dog from a cart outside of the New York Public Library. And so he sat down on the steps of the library because it was May and the weather was nice. And if you visit the New York Public Library on a nice May day, you will find it is covered with office workers who are all like looking at the sun for the brief period of the day that they get to do that. So he did that as well. And so he struck up a conversation with the person sitting next to him, who was about his age and working as a bicycle messenger in the city. The messenger told him he had moved to New York from Honduras with his family as a child. When Steve told him he was lost, they had a conversation about, well, here's where you need to go, because he was a messenger and he knew how to get there, but also about adjusting to life in a big city and being lost in another sense, right? Being lost in the sense of not knowing the language, being lost in the sense of not knowing what it is that you should do, and about the implications of the way that the US policy affects Central America and why his family came here and how the people who were living around his family were feeling about their chances of being able to stay in New York and those kinds of things. The interesting thing about Steve is that Steve found the global on the steps of the New York Public Library. Over dinner tonight, his professor is going to lead a discussion with the students about what they saw in their free afternoon about the impact of the world of finance on people in New York. And Steve's going to have a lot to say, right? He's going to be able to say some things about international trade deals and about the role of imported labor in US businesses. And even though Steve's study off campus was domestic and really the only kind he was going to be able to access given his major and his financial situation, he still is a global learner. All right. Up next, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Chris Stock and the Tropical Ephera nobilitata. This beetle is common in tropical areas, and Professor Stock is about to fulfill a career-long wish and go back to the site of his research fieldwork in his PhD and see how this cute little guy is doing. And he's taking his class with him on a 6-week summer experience in southern Costa Rica. The students will be locating the insects, cataloging things about them, and generally building up a database of updated information on how the beetles are doing, because the oil palm plantations in the southern part of the country have been expanding through the urban areas and down into the rural ones on the Osa Peninsula where they're going to be. And the students are extremely pumped about being real scientists on this trip. It's a little bit of a bummer, though, as they say they're going to be staying a little bit far from civilization because they're going to be living in a biological experiment station. The men will be in a male bunk room, and the women will be in a female bunk room, and they're going to share meals that are prepared by the station staff. Now, the station staff live in a nearby town, which mostly houses people who work on one of the oil palm plantations. And in the town, you can find a school for their children, and several small bars and restaurants, and a shop, and it's really pretty much a little self-contained world that they have there. Unfortunately, the students are only going to see it from the highway as they drive by on the way to the station. The students are looking forward to some time in the real Costa Rica when they make a trip to Jaco Beach for the weekend. Now, Dr. Stock did work to prepare his students for this experience off campus. They practiced their field techniques, And they had a chance to talk over Skype with a student from another American university who's working at the station, asking about her experiences living there. And so they learned important things like that there are going to be ants everywhere and they need to bring a lot of sunscreen. What are Dr. Stock's students going to learn? They're going to learn a lot about their subject area. In fact, the hands-on nature of the experience and the range of the specimen that they're studying mean that off-campus study could provide unique lessons that are going to be tough to replicate back on campus. They're likely to learn skills in field research. What they may not learn, though, is why the beetle is having this problem in the first place, right? So Dr. Stock's need to go and do this study to replicate the work that he did way back in his doctorate was because the environment for the beetle is changing. There's some important context about why and how the environment for the beetle is changing that is less likely to be a lesson because the students aren't being asked to learn it. And they're not really given a chance to interact with the locals. Now, you could talk to Dr. Stock and say, you'd have a good chance to do that. Maybe instead of going to the beach, you could go talk to the people in the town, whatever. And he's going to tell you, well, my job is to teach and study insects. I am not an international development professor. I would not know how to teach international development. It would not be appropriate for me to do that, and therefore we are going to the beach. On faculty-led programs, seminar research that we've found finds that faculty themselves are global learners, but that the conceptions of faculty as global learners vary a lot within even a single institution. All right, so we'll leave Dr. Stock behind. And this is Samantha Stock. Samantha is dressed warmly even at this time of year because she's spending 6 months in a place where it's winter right now. She's set weekly goals for herself as she adjusts to living with her host family and taking classes at the local university. Last week, it was to go with the host family to a religious service, even though she isn't religious herself. And this week, she wants to have conversations of more than 5 minutes each with people on campus she hasn't met yet, because she is at the university the only person from her home school. She was pretty well prepared for her time in Montevideo. She traveled a lot with her family as a child. Her parents had a goal of visiting all the countries but Antarctica while she was with them, and they almost made it. They missed Australia. She studied Spanish starting in 6th grade and placed into third-year courses when she started college, but continued taking language anyway. Her mom studied abroad in Spain as a student and encouraged Samantha to try the same. So why did Samantha make the choice to study overseas, and why did she choose this kind of program instead of a program like Sally had? It wasn't because it was easy, because I'll tell you, Samantha is an engineering major. And her list of required courses is extensive and very sequenced. But like many students from affluent backgrounds, she came into college with a good bit of AP credit and required elementary level courses. So when she first met with her advisor before she registered for her first courses her freshman year, her advisor asked her, would you like to study abroad sometime when you're at the university? And she said yes, and they worked on arranging her courses so that she could do an off-campus semester and still graduate on time. There's a number of factors that play into student choices of abroad experiences: demographics like income, influence from others like her parents and her advisor, previous experiences like language studies and coursework. They have all been found to matter. What's less well understood is how those factors all play together, and that's the focus of one of our seminar projects. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to Svetlana Stakova. And she is a student from Bulgaria who is spending a semester at a mid-sized private university in the heartland of the US, going from one wheat field to another. And more students come into the United States than leave to study abroad by a pretty sizable margin. So what is Svetlana going to learn? I think it's reasonable to assume that the factors that influence student learning across cultures and across campuses are consistent across students as well, right? If the context is a factor, the context is a factor. So you can have that. What we do not know, and so there's some sort of case study level research that would indicate that that's the case. What we don't know about Svetlana is how much she's going to impact others. So let's say their first year, or Sally's first year, Svetlana was Sally's roommate for a semester. Or she was in one of Sally's classes, or something like that. Do you think then maybe Sally would have known a little bit more about Europe? Or she might have perhaps chosen to study someplace that wasn't London? Maybe, we don't know. Would learning to live with Svetlana have enriched Sally's intercultural competence the way we expect that it would influence Svetlana's? Probably, but we don't know. What happens at Svetlana's home university when she gets back? We don't really know that either. These are questions that are sort of at the margins of current research, with a few case study recommendations that are giving the paths of inquiry as we move forward, but we don't really know a lot of details about that. But what we do know is that these are important questions. It was interesting for me as I was preparing for this work. All of our seminar groups turned in bibliographies, and so I've spent a few weeks reading all of the papers in your bibliographies. And the thing that was interesting to me was how similar the introductions to all of the papers are. So you tell me, why do you think people said that off-campus study was important?
The economy.
They can get jobs. Yep. Global competition. Anything else? It wasn't that much about learning, surprisingly. I know, shocking, right? But it really wasn't. I mean, yeah, it was, it's global competitiveness, students can get jobs, that kind of stuff over and over and over again. But there's a lot of impacts when students go to other places, that some of which we know a lot about and some of which we don't. And so now my colleague Neal's going to come up and talk a little bit about why we really do need to care about this kind of stuff.
I'm afraid I'm very much old school, no slides. But I think what's exciting is that Amanda has laid out this broad breadth of global learners that we're dealing with, and the different sorts of learners. And within these, the different communities of students and faculty, and what a wide range this is. In terms of reviewing what we're learning about integrating global learning with the university experience, I've been very interested in some of the questions that I don't think we've asked often enough in tackling major research questions or sets of questions. And this is perhaps maybe the next step, which is, what will you do with your newfound knowledge? How will you use what you have learned? Will it make a difference? Who do you need to communicate your findings to? And the distinction, who will you communicate your findings to? Can you have learned to use these documents as a benchmark for existing practices, to demonstrate best practices, to influence or develop policies? And I couldn't resist this, I'm sorry. Who knows, you might even discover what Kofifi is. But asking the questions is the easy part. In part, the answers are going to depend on a couple of major factors. One is the role that you have on your campus, whether you're an off-campus study advisor, whether you're a faculty member or a senior administrator, and here I'm thinking of dean, vice president, but also the nature of your campus culture, which is why I asked the question, who do you need to communicate this to, and who will you communicate it to? So how you respond to this is going to be influenced directly by your day job. As an administrator, you can always ask someone further down the food chain to research X, Y, or Z for you, and hopefully provide the necessary resources. As a study away professional, you'll probably think of, but not say it out loud if asked to do this, along with everything else you're asking me to do, you want me to assess what the students we send to study off campus are learning? Really? And as a faculty member, we can't be told anything, so how badly do you really want to know what your students are learning? Let's go one step further. What new questions have been demonstrated by your research? New questions that you now perhaps want to know the answer to. For most of us, doing research is a luxury. We were having a conversation earlier this afternoon about how much of this is sort of self-motivation on our parts, and often for very little reward. And sometimes just making the time to discover the research findings that already exist is a challenge. I'm reminded here of a scene in The Tempest when Miranda says, "Oh, what a wonderful new world," and Prospero responds, "'Tis new to thee." But maybe we don't have to act alone. And I find this a very optimistic kind of piece of something that's happening on campuses. Increasingly, assessing what students are learning has become de rigueur. And since that's the case, and most of us are on campuses with Office of Institutional Research, and we all have departments of psychology and sociology and math, and they all teach statistics, don't we have some allies that we might be able to call upon to assist us in some of this? On some of our campuses, we even have graduate students who might play a role. And this may be essential if we're to use instruments that demonstrate real validity. Let me offer a couple of comments on the two subtitles to the symposium. And this is the prerogative I take as someone with gray hair who's retired, and I get to say these, and hopefully it's not too scandalous. So for the symposium, the subtitle is Higher Impact Abroad and Domestic Off-Campus Study, a mouthful that I prefer to call Study Away, or as they do here at Elon, Global Engagement. And also then to our introductory remarks of what we know, what we don't, and why it matters. So the first subtitle issue, we're talking about higher impact, which I am sure all of us take to mean higher impact practices. But on what grounds do we assume that study off campus, whether domestic or international, is a priori a high impact practice when it comes to student learning? Is graduating on time or with a higher GPA evidence of learning? Isn't labeling study off campus a higher impact practice just a hypothesis? The second issue that giving equal billing to in the symposium is both domestic and international. Do they have equivalent impact on students? But for a study that I'm aware of from the late 1960s and a couple of more recent ones, we don't know. But how can we know when domestic off-campus study programs are typically housed in different campus offices from study abroad? And then there, in addition, is community-based education. And here I'm thinking specifically of internships and also community service programs that are housed in student development, and programs which too many faculty, of course, consider second cousins to the academic program. However, if we believe in what we do, why should it be tabooed to be comprehensive about the relative merits of our own enterprise versus other aspects of higher education? And on a positive note, I want to say, although I was not part of it, there was an inaugural meeting at the last NAFSA meeting of a domestic program MIG. This is a really major change. And I say that because in Boston at NAFSA 2 years ago, Stylus Press was not allowed to sell or present the book, Putting the Local and Global Education, Models for Transformative Learning Through Domestic Off-Campus Programs. So we can make the case over and over about the critical need for global learning as a foundation for global understanding, to the point that sometimes many of us sound like we're just delivering platitudes. But we need to keep saying it, and I'm not suggesting we stop. However, what we don't speak enough is to global learning as a foundation for our also understanding our neighbors, be they next door, across town, or across the country. If I can allowed to paraphrase W. Kamau Bell here, he said something to the effect of, as surprised, appalled, or delighted as you may have been by Donald Trump's victory, maybe what it should be telling you is you now know that you probably don't know as much about America as you thought. People in our midst who either no longer feel or felt part of the broader society in which they live are left out. They're invisible to the rest of us. They're the other that we exclude, not the geographically distant other that we usually think of with that term, but strangers, invisible and excluded in our own country. If we argue for the critical importance of study abroad, and I certainly have and continue to do so, as necessary to give students a firsthand experience living and studying in another culture, why would we exclude students from having a similar experience in the United States? And why would we not put at least the same amount of effort into students having these sorts of foundational experiences at home? But still, that doesn't answer the overriding question. Are either of these higher impact learning practices? And how, when it comes to student learning, do they compare? As to the subtitle, what we know, what we don't, and why it matters, I want to make a couple of additional points. The first point is about invisibility. We're looking at how global learning impacts the university experience here in the US. But how is it impacting our hosts on their campuses, in their communities, with their families where our students eat and sleep, as well as the non-US based faculty who hopefully are teaching our students, and the organizations that offer our students hands-on experience that they list on their resume? Where is the research that explores and examines the role of these individuals and groups that are, or should be, our students' most influential teachers? The second point is, what we don't know and why it matters is also rather basic, but as an academic, it remains a major conundrum for me, and I suspect, dare I say, for the majority of faculty members on your campus. What do the faculty want their students on an off-campus study program to learn? And are these learning objectives the same as those thought of by the off-campus study advisors, by the senior administrators who are always looking at the bottom line cost and even having off-campus study programs, or by the parents who pay the bills? At its simplest, what students can learn through off-campus study might be summarized, and I say this is crude: disciplinary knowledge and intellectual skills, cultural knowledge and skills, values perspective, and personal engagement. But who prioritizes which? And is the acquisition of basic disciplinary knowledge, is it intercultural competence? Is it about global competence, using knowledge and skills to engage with critical global issues? And I don't mean any of this to be critical of the terrific research questions that those of you presenting in this symposium have identified and sought to answer. They're all exciting and challenging. I'm simply pointing out, for me, what are the obvious. You've got great data, and you've drawn significant conclusions that need to be shared. So I'm excited that we now have this opportunity to share. But don't stop there. Keep thinking, reflecting, developing new ideas, and conducting research. We've still got a lot to learn. Thank you.